to hear from President Zelenskyy is that he has regret for what happened. He's ready to sign this minerals deal, and that he's ready to engage in peace talks.
It was a sad day for our country. It was a dumpster fire of diplomacy. It should not have been done.
Tariffs are easy, they're fast, they're efficient, and they bring fairness.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, diplomatic reverberations after the clash in the Oval Office between President Trump and the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. President Trump says Zelenskyy should be more thankful more frequently for U.S. support. Zelenskyy, for his part, said he is grateful, but he has not apologized for that memorable dust-up at the White House Friday. Trump said Zelenskyy simply is not ready for peace.
Well, I just think he should be more appreciative because this country has stuck with them through thick and thin.
Tariff Tuesday, President Trump said he's going to follow through with his threats to slap Canada and Mexico with 25% levies. China will also see its tariff rate rise from 10% to 20%. All this just hours before the president is set to deliver an address to Congress about his economic plans. He will, to put it mildly, have much to talk about. Education confirmation. The Senate is set this afternoon to approve Linda McMahon to lead the Department of Education. President Trump, you might remember, has said he wants to dismantle that bureaucratic agency. He said he wants McMahon to, quote, put herself out of a job. I want to start tonight with Olivia Rinaldi and Scott McFarland at the desk with me. Olivia, it's great to see you. Scott, also great to see you. Olivia, today there was continued conversation about the status of the relationship between the Trump administration, Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. Could this minerals deal that was right on the edge of being signed and put together Friday, if it's still even viable? What do we know?
Let's call it a delicate dance between the two leaders right now. We heard that olive branch
with
from
some
Zelenskyy.
Toes being stepped on.
Yes, certainly. We heard Zelenskyy say today he's still willing to sign that deal. And that's what we heard from National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. He said if he says he wants to sign the deal and he's interested in peace, there is a path forward. But the peace part, that was the part today we heard Trump talk about the most. Zelenskyy over the weekend said he thinks the war in Ukraine, now going on 3 years, could go on much longer. He doesn't see a path for peace in the immediate future. Trump said he did not like that. He hopes that's not the case. And if he keeps talking like that, then the U.S. is no longer interested in having this conversation.
And yet also the president, when asked today, are you going to withhold aid from Ukraine? He said, we're not even talking about that.
Right.
That also seems to be like a seam that suggests there's a little bit more space and room for Zelenskyy and Trump to figure out a way to resolve this.
There are certainly conversations going on behind the scenes with Trump's top advisors, Tulsi Gabbard, Mike Waltz, Secretary Rubio, Vance, I'm told, is in some of those conversations. And it's all about how we can posture, have this go forward, have these conversations with the Russians, make them feel good, but also get what we need out of Ukraine. That minerals deal was something the White House wanted signed. They were upset, they told me, that it didn't get signed because, one, it gave Ukraine what they needed, which was some assurances that the U.S. is going to put some economic engine behind their reconstruction efforts if there is an end to this war. But it also gives the U.S. a reason to care about the security and the sovereignty of Ukraine, for this administration to care about it. And that didn't happen. The White House said they were upset about it. Let's see if there's a path forward.
Olivia, I want to play for you Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, all in an order on this. Let's listen.
What we need to hear from President Zelenskyy is that he has regret for what happened.
That's not a peacemaker. That's a troublemaker. And that's what the president saw.
Apologize for turning this thing into the fiasco for him that it became. There was no need for him to go in there and become antagonistic.
So that's a somewhat high bar, but there obviously is some wiggle room beneath it.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. I mean, a lot of that, of what you've just heard, was some talking points by the Kremlin even. And we heard over the weekend the Kremlin say, we saw this as a gift.
Kind of applauding from afar.
Yeah. This was a historic moment, a gift, an opportunity. They saw it as a way to thaw those relations between Moscow and Washington, that perhaps there is some wiggle room for us to get back on the main stage and have what we want out of this. Perhaps it's all negotiation. Perhaps it's a way to kind of strong-arm Zelenskyy into doing exactly what they want need to do.
What an especially fragile moment for there to be uncertainty about aid to Ukraine, financial aid. This is the very moment Congress is figuring out what they're going to spend money on. They got a hard deadline of March 14th to get all these things buttoned up. And whether or not there's going to be Ukraine money moving forward has to come from Congress. What Republican's going to go out there right now and champion it, with Trump equivocating about the future of Ukraine?
If they do, they will do so very quietly.
Yes.
To their own detriment. This is a really big inflection point, and now we have uncertainty about aid to Ukraine.
And Scott, you talked to the acting Drug Enforcement Administration agency leader. What did you learn from that conversation? What's the context of the Trump administration's approach with this agency?
Well, there is definitely money going to border efforts, including new infusions into border security and drug interdiction. There is a new acting director of the Drug Enforcement Administration, and he has a big job to begin with. It just got bigger because the Trump administration has just declared a bunch of Latin American cartels to be terrorist organizations, foreign terrorist organizations, ratcheting up the pressure to keep anybody from getting any money to the cartels. But it puts them on a pretty even plane with some ISIS and Osama bin Laden level terrorists. Take a listen to what Derek Maltz, the new acting head of the DEA, had to say about that.
If somebody's watching this in their living room and they hear drug cartels, foreign terrorist organizations, it seems to be equating them with ISIS, bin Laden. Is that an accurate comparison?
150%. And I've been saying this for years. And this is why. If you look at the numbers, we're losing 100,000 plus Americans every year to these dangerous substances that are coming into this country.
Derek Maltz, again, the acting administrator of the DEA. There's all kinds of political issues here with declaring cartels terrorist organizations. It does send a message a lot of people like to hear, those who want more active interdiction of fentanyl and the stopping of the trafficking between the two countries. But there's a concern that if you'd name them terrorist organization, somebody unknowingly sending money to family back in Mexico, somebody who is trying to help somebody back in Mexico, may suddenly be materially supporting terrorists unknowingly and subject to prosecution.
Right, and the assumption most people have is if they're branded a terrorist organization, there's going to be some military action. But that's not necessarily on the table immediately. What's more important about that designation is all of the things that cannot touch them financially and the guardrails that this tries to establish, which could undermine them financially, but could ensnare people innocently.
That's exactly right. They want to starve the resources from these cartels, make it harder for them to do the business, the ugly business they do. But does that dry up all your sources on the ground with those cartels? If you're a DEA agent, you don't want to lose your sources. You'll lose a foothold in stopping the trafficking anyhow. This will be playing out over the coming weeks and months, but Major, there is actually a nominee to be the new full-time DEA administrator who gets this on his shoulders if confirmed.
Getting us off to a great start on this Monday. Scott McFarlane, Olivia Rinaldi, thank you very much. Turning now to Capitol Hill, House Speaker Mike Johnson says he's got a plan to avoid a potential government shutdown later on this month. He wants to pass, that is to say, Johnson, a short-term spending bill with no spending cuts. This would keep the government running until September, which is the end of the fiscal year. But as with anything contemplated by Speaker Johnson, with his very narrow majority, it is not unclear at the moment if he has the sufficient votes. Torian Small joins us now from Capitol Hill. Torian, what can you tell us about the plan and the votes?
Yeah, Speaker Johnson is looking to push through a clean CR. He had success with that in the last session. And really the reasoning behind this is so that spending level could stay at the same level as it has been before. He's calling it a freeze on spending. The problem with that, though, is hard right Republicans, the more fiscal conservative hawks, are saying that we need to do deeper spending cuts sooner than later outside of this big budget resolution, or one big beautiful bill, as Donald Trump is calling it. The problem, though, if Johnson deviates from that, is he loses Democrats who have been faithful in pushing through and avoiding government shutdowns in the past through these stopgap measures, which is why we're seeing him saying, let's move through as quickly as possible because March 14th is here sooner than later.
So there's a couple of hot stoves here politically, Tori. Let me see if I understand them. The one hot stove for Speaker Johnson is if you do this clean CR that you just described, that's essentially advocating for the Biden spending levels of this fiscal year. which, to your point, angers fiscal conservatives within his conference. If he puts DOGE, meaning Department of Government Efficiency, cuts in a CR, he loses the potential to get any Democratic votes. And if he's going on a bipartisan basis, he's got to put some combination of Republicans and Democrats together.
Yeah, I think the scientific term is damned if you do, damned if you don't. And we've seen before, especially the breakdown because of this in the relationship between Leader Hakeem Jeffries and Speaker Mike Johnson. Those two essentially haven't talked in a while. I attended his press briefing, Jeffries that is, at the end of last week, and asked him specifically, is he at the table negotiating with Speaker Johnson? Because he's alleging that Jeffries is completely walking away, putting in non-starters to the CR conversation. Jeffries said that he has directed his ranking member on the Appropriations Committee to lead these conversations, would not say whether or not he's interacting with Johnson. But again, there's an appetite from quite a few Republicans to start making deeper cuts sooner than later. But the problem is 218 members make up the House Republican Conference. If 30, for example, which is the number in the House Freedom Caucus, decide to abandon that, and you can't get Democrats, that means that you are going to see a shutdown.
Torian Small on Capitol Hill, thanks so very much. Questions about a possible conflict of interest within President Trump's tightest inner circle, why the FAA, Verizon, and Elon Musk's Starlink are all part of this roiling conversation. That's next. You're watching America Decides.
First of all, he wouldn't do it. And second of all, we're not going to let him do anything where there's a conflict of interest.
Welcome back. President Trump has left the nation with the impression that he will police and prevent Elon Musk from getting involved in anything that would constitute a conflict of interest. Musk, of course, is exerting tremendous influence over many federal agencies. And this has raised concerns among Democrats and some outside observers. Democrats on Capitol Hill have expressed deep concern over Musk's Starlink company and efforts underway that might allow it, in some way or another, to take over a $2.4 billion contract between the FAA and Verizon. Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat, wrote that the potential deal, which isn't been signed or anything yet, it's just potential, quote, reeks of the most corrupt, self-serving abuses that federal procurement laws and principles are intended to prevent. Again, that's a quote. I want to bring in Politico aviation reporter Oriana Pollock. Oriana, help our audience catch up on this. They may not have seen all of your great reporting or the reporting of others. You have the FAA, you have Verizon, and Starlink. What is the status of their relationship and this potential contract?
So a couple days ago, Elon Musk had been talking about very publicly on his social media platform X that there is a problem with the current contract as it stands. And he had been falsely blaming Verizon, saying that they cannot do the infrastructure work that it takes. But really, he backtracked later and said, actually, I falsely accused the wrong contractor. It's L3 Harris that has the current system. But he, of course, offered a very quick solution, and that solution is his very own company, Starlink, to do a satellite-based infrastructure upgrade. And so ultimately, it hangs in the balance of what the FAA is going to decide next, whether or not Verizon will be kicked off this, again, as you mentioned, $2.4 billion contract, which is already in the works. It was awarded in 2023, and whether or not Starlink will come in and have this, quote, quick fix as he's so far proposing.
And if I've read Verizon's assessment of this, they're saying the systems that they put together are being tested and prepared. They don't seem to be backing away from this at all. They want to keep what they've got contracted. Is that correct?
Yeah, so far, Verizon is saying that they haven't heard otherwise from the FAA, that so far everything is proceeding as planned. Again, they won this contract back in 2023 in a competitive bidding process. So for another company to just have eminent domain and come in and take over on something like this would ultimately open up the entire thing to lawsuits. As you've pointed out, Democrats on Capitol Hill are very concerned about all of this. It raises many questions on how this could upend a lot of protocols that are already in place, and again, what the FAA is going to decide to do with that going forward.
And you said a key phrase there, Oriana, competitive bid process. It's not just preferred, it's federal law. There has to be a process, has to be evaluated, and those who have won contracts, whether it's with the FAA or anyone else, have rights. And if Musk does succeed at some level of stepping in, as you mentioned, he'll be taken to court.
I'm sure that would happen. And again, I think that some contractors are open to having Starlink be complementary. It's not like they're pushing back and saying Starlink isn't the solution here. It may be a complementary system to what Verizon is already doing. But again, that's a question for the FAA and what the FAA wants to do as it looks to overhaul all these systems that Musk has now, kind of put his foot in the door into, now looking forward and saying, I can do this better.
And Oriana, what is your understanding of the principal needs at the FAA? Is it air traffic controllers? Is it a new system? Is the system, and I know Elon Musk misidentified what the problem was and the contractor, but he said some very dire and scary things about the system and its possible shutting down. I mean, is it that fragile?
I mean, there are things that, moving from one system to the next has taken years, and even lawmakers have criticized how slow it has been to upgrade and modernize a lot of these systems because they are so old and outdated. What he's talking about in terms of these catastrophic losses that could happen any day now is to be determined. The FAA has not put out any kind of assessment on what he means exactly, and whether or not that's in Verizon's camp, whether or not that's in L3 Harris's camp. But there are multiple things going on here on the system itself, which is stretched thin and does need modernization and upgrading, as well as the controllers every day who use them themselves, and the shortage there on staff and just how stressed out they are. So multiple things happening at the same time.
Oriana, real quickly, does SpaceX have anything to do with this story? It's another Musk-owned company.
Sure. I mean, they have been fined by the FAA. They were fined last year about $633,000 because they deviated from launch plans. And Musk was very vocal about that and how upset he was that they took a laser focus on his company for no reason. He said he adhered to safety protocols and that they fixed it. Of course, at the time, FAA Administrator Mike Whitaker disagreed, and their launch plans were shuttled for a bit until they resolved that, as well as other things going on with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So he does have an out, I should say, for the FAA and all of the things that have gone on with that agency and between him.
An axe to grind and a pending contract. All very interesting. Oriana Pollock with Politico. Thanks so much. Well, a divided America seems to agree at least on one thing at this stage, assessing the Trump presidency. The president is making several changes, notable ones, to the federal government. Public attitudes about whether those changes are good or bad is a bit more mixed. The latest CBS News polling will explore that next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. The vast majority of Americans have come to the conclusion President Trump is, at one level or another, transforming the federal government. But they're not quite sure if this is a good thing or a bad thing. CBS News polling shows 81% of those surveyed think the president is making significant changes to government functions. 40% of those, however, believe these changes are for the worse. CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, your friend and mine, Anthony Salvanto, joins me now from Studio 57. Anthony, always great to see you. Break this down for us.
Indeed. Good to talk to you, Major. Look, when you ask people about this in principle, Donald Trump's efforts to reduce the staff at government agencies, you get this split, right? Democrats say they're opposed. Republicans, big majority, say they approve. But behind that, I followed up and I said, well, what do you think is going to happen? And here's where those partisans split, and then I'll tell you a story in a moment. Republicans saying big numbers, they'll remove unnecessary jobs. They'll make federal agencies work better. Democrats, by contrast, think that that's going to remove essential workers, impact their local area. Now, why do you see not just partisan splits, but this wide variety of responses to what might happen? Because it's new. Because people, yes, they see or they think they're going to see an impact. They're not yet collectively sure what that's going to be. And that's how we watch this play out, right? We haven't seen a lot like this before. And so that's why you get that wide range of possibilities, I should say,
In the data, Anthony, what did you learn, if anything, about how the country feels about Elon Musk?
Well, two things. One is that also splits, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, but I'm going to start with this, Major. People generally think there is at least some waste in federal spending. Democrats tend to say it comes from poor spending choices. Republicans, they say that too, but also suspect there's fraud in the system. Now, where does that lead? Depending on the way this breaks, you might say it also impacts what you think about Elon Musk and DOGE. So that's why you see these partisan breaks on that, where Republicans, by and large, think it hit DOGE and Elon Musk, ought to have at least some influence on government operations and spending, and the bulk of Democrats fall down there in the not much or none. That's what backfills opinion on Musk and DOGE.
Anthony, you know and I know every American has an opinion on whether the president is prioritizing properly. What does our data tell us?
As a tongue twister there, I won't try to repeat it, but I will show you a poll about that. Look, let me scan over here to that slide, because there's a disconnect. Quite frankly, there are plenty of issues, immigration for one, where they think he's prioritizing it and he rates well on it. But look, this list, what should be a high priority for Donald Trump, it will come as no surprise to viewers of this program that people say inflation, people say the economy, right? We've been tracking that. People still say their incomes aren't keeping up with inflation. But to your question, which issues do you think he's prioritizing a lot? And then we get all the way down here on this side of the scale, just a very, very smaller number, 29%. Think he's giving a lot of priority to inflation, similarly low on the economy. What does that tell you? We're headed into the speech tomorrow night. This is one of the things we want to track, whether that gap gets bigger or smaller between what they want him to do and whether or not they think he's prioritizing inflation.
Proper presidential prioritization. Don't try that at home, ladies and gentlemen. Anthony Salvanto, thank you, my friend.
Thanks, man.
Looming tariffs against America's three largest trading partners, what impact they could have on consumers, and how to assess the risks of economic retaliation. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Thanks for staying with us. We are just hours away from President Trump's decision, which is pending, to place large tariffs on United States trading partners, namely Canada, Mexico, China. Barring an intervention by the president, last minute, at midnight tonight, the U.S. will impose 25% tariffs on all imports from Canada and Mexico. Tariffs on goods from China will increase from 10% to 20%. And I want to bring in Kelly O'Grady and Sarah McGregor for reporting and analysis on this. Kelly is a CBS News Money Watch correspondent. Sarah, the managing editor for Bloomberg News' national desk. Kelly, let me start with you. So we have this is not a stock market show, but let's put up a graphic about what happened to the Dow today. Down about 650 points. It was at one point almost 1,000 points down. There was tremendous volatility, not just in the Dow, but the other major indexes. The NASDAQ was down 1%. The S&P down 1.76%. Is almost all of that volatility driven by concern over these pending tariffs?
It absolutely was, Major. And in fact, you can look at when President Trump spoke those words that, well, this is actually happening. We are going to see those tariffs placed on Canada and Mexico at midnight. You saw the Dow go like this, the NASDAQ go like this, and the S&P go like this. Now, as you mentioned, we didn't close on session lows, but there's a lot of concern from companies, retailers. If you looked at the auto stocks, Ford, GM, they were all down over 1%, some even 3%. So, yeah, there's a lot of concern. I think a lot of investors were hoping that there was going to be an 11th hour deal. When we got that information that this is indeed going through as of now, it pretty much fell off a cliff.
Sarah, Kelly mentioned autos. I did some checking, and I hope these numbers are correct. In 2023, the United States exported about $65 billion in autos, imported $208 billion, $45 billion of auto imports from Mexico, number one. $35 billion in auto imports from Canada, they're number three. That's a lot of cars coming from those two countries. And if there are 25% tariffs, and we'll get to auto parts in a second, but just on cars, consumers will see that, feel that, and that might materially change the marketplace, right?
Absolutely. I've seen data that car prices are already an average of about $50,000 now with all the new electronics and sort of high-tech cars, the move to EVs. So already car prices are pretty high comparably. And I think that is the threat that this could really drive those up further. There's statistics about the number of times that car parts go across the border. This is a really fluid border. Of course, we've had NAFTA, USMCA, now as it's known, in place for decades now. And I think that people are really used to that. And at the same time, Trump really wants to speak to his audience. And when we talk about cars, that's an industry that's near and dear to Americans' hearts. I think they really feel like that represents America, the auto industry that comes from it. So, there's a lot at stake with these tariffs, and the car industry really represents that.
And Kelly, there was an announcement at the White House today about $100 billion of investment. We don't know if it's new. It may have already been planned, but it was announced with some fanfare from TSMC, that's Taiwan Semiconductor. What is the importance of that particular investment?
So TSMC, is almost as important as NVIDIA to the chip industry and sort of the AI race. I think it's important for two reasons. One, President Trump was able to say, hey, I'm putting tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and these other countries, at the same time that he was able to say, look, you have a company coming and manufacturing their products in the United States. I think that was very timely. The other thing is, from a supply chain perspective, from a national security perspective, most of TSMC's chips are made in Taiwan. Having those chips made here, just as the United States is trying to become the leader, continue to be the leader in artificial intelligence, that's a big deal. It's also a big deal. It's going to create a lot of jobs, Major.
And TSMC already has a sizable footprint in Arizona where this investment, and again, we don't know if it's all brand new or an addition to what was already contemplated, will be in Arizona.
That's correct. Yes, it was referenced. Arizona was a big part of the conversation this afternoon.
Sarah, the president also made an announcement over the weekend about a cryptocurrency reserve. And that sparked some applause in the crypto space, but also some blowback in Silicon Valley from those who thought it should all be Bitcoin, or there were other things. Sort of the libertarian part of Silicon Valley was a little bit perturbed about this. There's supposed to be a summit at the end of this week on the future of crypto in America. How do you assess all that?
We've seen unprecedented support for President Trump from the tech industry this time around. Of course, if we just saw who was at his inauguration ceremony, he is getting a lot of support. And we're just talking about TSMC and this massive investment that they're making. That adds to $1 trillion in spending that has been promised since Trump took office. And that's largely companies like Apple, Meta, some of these tech companies. So we can see a real sort of integration right now of Trump's support base, and sort of some of these promises that he's getting made about investment in the U.S., they are coming from the tech industry. So it's interesting how they're playing into each other, and some of the promises, like this crypto promise that Trump's making, that may play into some of that relationship that they're having, that tightening of the relationship.
And Sarah, I'll ask you, and then we'll give Kelly a chance also. Kelly talked about, and we highlighted the volatility today, but the volatility has been running through the markets basically for the last couple of months. And there are some analysts I have read who are a little bit concerned about a softening of the job market and a potential rough sledding for the U.S. economy, quite separate from the tariff conversation. What are your thoughts?
Yes, there's already been some indicators that show a bit of a softening in the economy. Of course, we talked about some of those down arrow charts today. The loonie and the peso were also down. The enemy of the markets is uncertainty. And I think this ongoing tariff war is really going to play a part, because we have tariffs that will take effect, as we just talked about, at 12:01 a.m. But then there's going to be retaliation. There's probably going to be an escalation from the Trump administration. And again, that continuation still in aluminum, European tariffs. So straight down the line, we don't know how long these tariffs will be in place for. So the markets and the economy writ large, I think, are, this uncertainty kind of playing into it. It's really hard to see right now how it's going to play out, but there has been a softening.
Kelly, you get the final word.
Well, I think it'll be very interesting to hear President Trump tomorrow night. He has always looked at the markets as a metric for success. And I'll just leave you with this, Major. The Atlanta Fed tracks GDP. What they're estimating for the quarter could always change. But right now, based on that drop in consumer spending we saw last week, it looks like Q1 GDP, first quarter GDP, is on track to be negative. So that will be sort of the context around that address he'll be giving tomorrow.
Kelly O'Grady, Sarah McGregor, thank you very, very much. That was great. More than 3 years of war in Ukraine. Now a new book is outlining what it argues has been decades of mistakes by Republicans and Democrats that may have contributed, or at least brought in to some focus, why Russia invaded Ukraine. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. That was certainly a conversation starter. You know what I'm talking about. What happened in the Oval Office on Friday between President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. I want to talk about my next guest. He's got a new book called The Folly of Realism: How the West Deceived Itself About Russia and Betrayed Ukraine. Its author is Alexander Vindman. Alexander, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to irritate everyone associated with the show in the control room because I'm going to read from your book. We don't have a graphic, so just bear with me, ladies and gentlemen. Page 218. Vladimir Putin has a notable talent for reading the characteristic tropes and leanings of his Western counterparts and ruthlessly exploiting the hopes and fears that to him reflect nothing but timidity, indecision, and weakness. Your book argues this is a long-running pattern that Republicans and Democrats have fallen into and deceived themselves about for a long time.
So I think the initial premise is that Russia is exceptional. It's one of the great powers, large country, large military, large nuclear arsenal. Because of that, Russia gets treated a little differently. And on that basis, uniquely because Russia has the largest or second largest nuclear arsenal in the world, we succumb to hopes and fears consistently. We've succumbed from George H.W. Bush 35 years ago to present day. I think where we are now is, frankly, we're in a massive self-deception stage where we completely forget all the history lessons of the past, the fact that Russia has been reneged on its previous agreements, that it's promised or overpromised all sorts of different things and failed to deliver. And we haven't even started with the fear stage. That's when Russia starts to some nuclear saber rattling when it doesn't get what it wants. So it's a pretty dangerous place we find ourselves in today.
And the book argues, and I think it makes a very cogent argument on this basis, that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had a sizable number of nuclear weapons of all varieties, and it became a compulsion, and not an illogical compulsion, of the U.S. administration to get the nukes out of Ukraine. Russia had an interest in getting the nukes out of Ukraine. Talk about that and what posture that left Ukraine in after.
So I think the fact is that we had a very benign view of Russia at the time, maybe somewhat justified because it was the hopes of Gorbachev and then Yeltsin following that maybe we could work with these folks.
Add him to the G8, bring him into the College of Nations.
But the problem is that the Ukrainians understood Russia. They understand Russia. They've always understood it better because they've had a 1,000-year relationship. For the last 300 years, they've been struggling for independence. They knew that there was a danger, and in giving up their nuclear weapons, they wanted security assurances. We initially leaned on Ukraine heavily to try to get them to give up their nuclear weapons to Russia, and they said no, just like Zelenskyy stood his ground recently, because he understands the costs. This is real to them. This is existential. And it's only when the U.S. said, okay, well, you know what? It's not just that we're going to ask you to give up your nuclear weapons, but we'll also give you your support that you need to transition into our market economy to help align with the West. That's when we got them on board. Trying to push these folks doesn't make a lot of sense. They fought an Orange Revolution in 2004. They fought another revolution in 2014. They're fighting Russia, a superpower. They're not a group of people to get pushed around, especially when it's their existential, their very existence on the line.
You argue in the book that we also misperceive Ukraine's sense of self, that we think they're anti-Russian as opposed to organically Ukrainian. Why does that matter?
Well, I think for the Ukrainian people, they've been struggling for independence against Russia for about 300 plus years. They had some brief moments in which they had some autonomy. Slowly but surely, the Russian Empire squeezed them. They had a brief moment of autonomy in the 20th century after the First World War, but the Soviet Union came in and conquered them. They've always had a national identity, a different language, a different culture. frankly, they're just a different people. I mean, you could feel a different kind of a temperament of the populations between, I served in Moscow, I served in Ukraine as an army officer. And they for 34 years, 35 years now, they've been existing as a separate, sovereign, independent state. They've hardened that identity. They will not be returned to Russian control.
How about the theory, and I've heard this expressed from several different administrations, starting with the Obama administration, America and Europe will never care as much about Ukraine as Russia does.
That is true.
And Russia will give whatever it takes to explore and exploit its interest in Ukraine and will outlast the West.
Yeah. I think there's something to be said about that, but that just means greater resolve, meaning that the Russians by themselves will not come to the fact that they're no longer an empire, that they can't control this territory, this vital piece of territory that if they get under their control, they are really advancing the empire-building project. It doesn't stop there. They have aspirations. They've controlled large swaths of Eastern Europe after the Second World War, throughout the Cold War. But if the fact is that the Ukrainians have been defending themselves highly effectively for 3 years, the Russians do not have all the advantages. They're actually also, the time is not on their side. Attritional warfare is costing them enormously for manpower, and they're running out of material support. If we push the Ukrainians a little bit further or give them a little bit more aid, they're fighting this war entirely on their own, they could break the Russians, and that is what ends Russia's imperial aspirations.
So when you hear the president on Friday say, you don't have the cards, what does that tell you?
That tells me that he's deceiving himself about Russia. He buys into Russian exceptionalism, completely unwarranted. He buys into the fact that these promises that Putin is going to give up willingly, you made the point that he will not, and that he also doesn't understand Ukraine and their spirit, their desire for independence. I think the lesson for this from this book for me is that we keep making the same mistakes over and over. We've attempted resets with Russia. We've never fully invested in Ukraine. This is a moment in which we could actually pin back Russia, that's an enormous adversary to us, and help Ukraine achieve its independence. And really, that's the lasting piece. That's the prescription and the lasting piece. Not to give away the farm, not to accommodate Russia, and to betray Ukraine again and again.
The book, The Folly of Realism, subtitle, How the West Deceived Itself About Russia and Betrayed Ukraine. Alexander Vindman, thank you, sir.
Thank you for having me on.
Thousands of federal workers across agencies, well, they've been fired. We're going to take a closer look at who and where they are as more cuts appear to be on the way. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. Several former federal employees fired as a result of the Trump administration's widespread Department of Government Efficiency workforce cuts are expected to attend President Trump's congressional address tomorrow night at the invitation of Democrats. New reporting from the American Communities Project looks into just how far-reaching these mass layoffs and their economic consequences could be. The American Communities Project's director and founder, Dante Cini, joins me now at the table. Dante, it's always good to see you. Let's talk about the composition of the federal workforce. People think it's just full-time equivalent employees. It's also contractors and grant recipients. A lot of people in our country.
Yeah, in fact, we looked at it differently. So everybody keeps talking about, I think, like 2.4 million federal workers. Those are FTEs, full-time equivalents. But when you look at grant recipients, contractors, huge number, Postal Service, which they've also talked about having some
reductions,
right? You're getting close to 9 million people.
Right.
It's a lot of people. And we looked at the way it's spread around the country. So it's 9 million people, and it's not all in Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia. It's scattered everywhere.
80% of that federal workforce outside of the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia. Yes, there's a concentration here for
Absolutely.
sure. That 20% ratio is higher than any other state, but that dispersal touches every state in the union.
Absolutely, and even when you look at the map and you look at how it's spread out, some parts of states more than others. So, like you have a big federal agency with a satellite office in your town or your county, that can be a big chunk of employment, especially in some of these rural communities where there aren't a lot of private sector jobs. There just aren't. The state, federal, state workforce, local workforce, and federal workforce, big employers. And you go to some of these communities, you whack out 20 jobs, Those are jobs that are not, it's not easy for people to find
Dante,
work.
we had an economist on this program last week talking about 1,000 IRS agents to be fired in Kansas City. That's not a rural place. That's not an economically strapped place, but 1,000 employees like that makes a big difference.
Well, think about the way we would report on this if this were a plant closing, right? Like we report, well, plant's closing, hundreds of people are going to be able to work. This is a major impact on this community. That could be happening all around the country, little big things like Kansas City, drips and drabs, smaller places, but big impacts.
And, of course, that is part of the counter-narrative. Those who are supportive of the Trump administration's efforts say, well, hey, wait a minute.
Yeah.
The federal government's never trimmed or rarely trimmed the way the private sector has to go through realignments, reorgs, things like that. And so finally it's your time.
Right. Yeah, there might be some truth to that. I do think that everybody feels that the federal government needs to be watched a little more closely. You need to remove redundancies. Some redundancies are in the system for a reason, right? Federal government, just remember this, I would say to those people, like, you know, companies make cuts because they're not making the same money they used to.
Have to be responsive to shareholders if they're publicly traded.
Or if I'm from around Detroit, the auto industry. We just don't need people to turn bolts because we have machines to turn bolts now, so we don't need as much as we had before. But this is the federal government. I know that people don't like the fact that it is so big, but its mandates aren't getting any smaller in terms of what we're asking it to do. And these are big changes. Look, the idea that people want cuts is one thing. The idea you want cuts this way, this quickly, and this seemingly, you know,
in a jarring way economically.
Absolutely. These could have really big impacts.
And you have research on this phenomena in military communities and Native American communities.
So those are, when we looked at it, we have these 15 different types of county we look at. Every type we look at least 2% of the workforce are federal workers, at least. That's a lot. I know 2% doesn't sound like much, but we're talking hundreds of thousands of workers, right? But in the places we call the military posts and these Native American lands, you're talking 7% of the workforce, 8% of the workforce. These are big numbers. Yeah. And you see even, all right, so we're not going to cut all these people. We're going to cut half. That's a lot. It's a lot of people.
Is there a political breakdown here that you found that might be counter to what people might assume?
So the one thing that we think is interesting when we looked at the data, when you talk about the percentage of workers in the federal workforce in one way or another, the big cities, which are places that vote heavily Democratic, are actually on the lower half of the 15 community types we looked at. They're still a number, but they're down toward the bottom. Some of these, it's these rural communities where, frankly, there aren't a ton of private sector jobs in some of these places because of what's happened to small manufacturing and other things. Like, these are places that vote Republican, that are rural, that could get hit pretty hard.
And that might have a rippling political consequence. We'll have to keep an eye on that. Dante Cheney, thank you very much for the research and the expertise. That does it for today. I will be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.